When a gunman randomly takes aim at innocent people, what do you call it? A mass shooting for sure, but beyond that, labeling gets tricky. Some of the shootings are hate crimes, some workplace violence, some random and deranged. All are terrifying, but is it terrorism? While this week's massacre in San Bernardino was underway, there was a lot of speculation about whether it was an act of terrorism.
No one's using the word terrorism yet because they frankly don't know the motive, but all those things indicate planning and preparation.
Even without an official FBI declaration, many in the media were close to making the call.
They don't know if it's a terrorist incident, but certainly it has terrorized hundreds of individuals.
But the same could be said for the Charleston, South Carolina church shooting that left 9 dead, or the Colorado Planned Parenthood shooting over Thanksgiving that left 3 dead.
A gunman opened fire on police and civilians at a Planned Parenthood clinic this afternoon.
The New York Times is also asking the question, is it terror or murder? An issue that's become a political hot potato, as some Muslims and communities of color claim it's only labeled terror when it's one of them. The horrific incident in Paris 3 weeks ago, where more than 130 died, was obvious from the outset. But things are not always so clear. Consider the assumptions made by witnesses of the San Bernardino massacre.
Witnesses described the men dressed in military-style gear.
Police say the masked gunmen were wearing body armor.
Police say up to 3 heavily armed gunmen.
And even after it was clear it was just 2, a married couple, the scrutiny was on him.
The relative says he and Malik had a 6-month-old baby girl.
But apparently it was she who had a mission. Just to make that point clear, by the way, these 2 newspaper covers, New York Post and the Daily News, labeled the guy a terrorist before it was officially announced today, by the way, by the FBI that they are investigating this as a terrorist incident. I mean, once again, this is the temptation of the media. And I have to say, and I'm sure every news organization in town, because I know I have, what's wrong with you people? What are you so chicken about? Why can't you just call it what it is? And we had this discussion during the Charleston thing. Well, it's not always so clear what it is. And the problem is that as much of the verbiage in the English language, there's some confusion here, because being terrified or terrorized is different than terrorism. And labeling something like this is an official term. Not that that is so clear, because there's a clear version for Europe what terrorism is, not so clear here, but the FBI has a defined definition of it.
Well, there is a legal definition of what a terrorist is, and in U.S. law, and it always leads to there has to be some destructive act, an assassination or something like this, that is intended to influence policy or government action in some way. That's the link. Well, we now know that that may well have been the case here.
May have been.
But it gets a little murkier when you start talking about some of the other mass shootings. I think many people and abortion rights advocates would argue that the attack on the abortion clinic in Colorado you're attempting to influence policy, you're attempting to affect the laws on abortion and so forth. But otherwise, the shooting in Charleston, it's a little bit tougher. Where's the line between mass murder and terrorism there?
Or hate crime
but
or racism.
The words have a meaning, and I think that's your point.
Well,
go ahead, Kelly.
No, what I was about to say is that I was going to follow up with you and say there is a definition, and the FBI's own definition, the Charleston murder fits. It's premeditated. It's exactly what you said. And the guy was linked up to these racist groups. That was his whole point. So what is the reluctance there? That's why people are angry about that. Don't label over here, if you followed all the details, that you say means terrorism. And this is the FBI standard. And yet we get to Charleston, and suddenly he's just a disturbed individual. Now, he may have been, but he could also be carrying out an act of terrorism.
Actually, the FBI language refers to an attempt to intimidate civilians or a government. It doesn't necessarily say ideology or religion. That comes into the statement that the UN uses, which is in itself just a placeholder, because in 40 years they haven't been able to agree on a firm definition. So I agree with the basic sentiment here. Words do matter. whether something's a terrorism or a hate crime, or is terrorism or a hate crime, excuse me, can affect the kind of resources that are thrown at it, the way it's treated by the law, and certainly the way the public reacts to it. And so it really, really matters. Dylan Klebold in Charleston, definitely.
Dylan Roof.
Dylan Roof, I beg your pardon, thank you. Definitely a political agenda there, an attempt to intimidate a class of citizens. Adam Lanza in Newtown, maybe not so much.
Well, that's, I'm glad you brought up Adam Lanza, because to me, this isn't that difficult a distinction to make. And the way you might make it is to look at something that clearly was not terrorism in this sense, and that would be the horrible school shootings in Connecticut. This was clearly just a deranged young man who went off and committed one of the worst acts of mass murder in history. But most of these other cases, you can see some sort of political motive, some sort of attempt to intimidate. Certainly in Charleston, certainly with the Planned Parenthood shooting. And increasingly, it's looking like that with the San Bernardino shooting.
But the media has an obligation to wait until something is officially declared something. They can't go around calling things terrorism if it's not.
No, but at the same time, if you look up terrorism in the dictionary, you're not going to see them citing what the FBI says. A lot of these words have plain English meanings and legal meanings.
Yeah, but I think, to Emily's point, we, understanding that it has a legal meaning, need to stay away from it until it has been assigned as a legal course of action. Because, to John's point, more resources come into play, and how the person, if alive, is sentenced comes into play.
That's right.
So this is very important.
I don't believe that there's a domestic terrorism law, so none of these would be labeled as terrorism.